Hello, I'm Rich from Medieval History Buff. I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. Please feel free to hit the like and subscribe button, as well as leave me a comment below. Thanks. On the death of Athelstan in 939, his son Edmund I succeeded as king. He was a young man, born in the 920s, and not out of his teens when he became king. Edmund soon developed a good reputation and was as capable militarily as his predecessors had been. He took back control of places like Leicester, Lincoln, Derby, and Nottingham, which had been claimed by the Danish, before he besieged the Danish king Olaf after he had raided Tamworth. Edmund and Olaf eventually allied with each other, and Olaf converted to Christianity. In 945, Edmund took a prudent step and gave lands to the Scottish king Malcolm I, in order to stop further opportunistic raids from up north. Just a year later, however, Edmund I was stabbed to death. He had only reigned for about 7 years and was only about 25 or 26 when he died, but Edmund had shown great potential, and the fact that the Scots swore loyalty to his brother, who succeeded him, showed his diplomatic skills in 945 with Malcolm I had not gone unrewarded. Edmund was succeeded by his brother Edred. Thanks to the good work of Edmund I, Edred's reign got off to a good start, with oaths of loyalty being sworn to him by the Scottish. But in 948 he encountered problems with the Northumbrians, who continued to be troublesome. They would not acknowledge Edred as their king, and instead supported the claim of a Dane, by the name of Eric. Edred responded to this by marching north and laying waste to Northumbria. Believing he had brought the Northerners back into line, Edred decided to make his way home, but on the way back, his forces were attacked from behind. Threatened with retaliation, and perhaps realizing Edred would unleash an even more fearful attack upon them than he had already done, the Northerners gave up, and in 954 they drove Eric out after they had grown fed up with him. Edred's reign seems to have followed a similar path to his brother's, and he showed himself to be extremely capable in dealing with problems as well. But again, like Edmund I, his reign was short, and he died in 955, having ruled for just under a decade. Edred would be followed as king by his nephew Edwig, who was the son of Edmund I, and his reign would be even shorter than either his father's or his uncle's. His time as king was too short to be altogether too remarkable, but is probably best known for the story surrounding his feud with Abbot Dunstan, later made a saint. It was alleged that Edwig was forced to go back to his coronation feast after Dunstan had discovered him with a noblewoman. Dunstan was sent over the Channel into exile after he feuded with King Edwig. Edwig, though, died in 959 at around the age of 19. He was succeeded by his brother Edgar, who would leave an altogether better legacy and earn himself the title of the Peaceful. Edwig himself did not seem to have been a popular king, with his administration being strongly criticised. Edgar was more successful, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is quite lavish with its praise of his kingship. It praises Edgar for his ability to bring peace and stability to a realm better than any regime that had gone before, and that he ensured strong laws throughout the country. He took on board good counsel, and he had good judgment. He is criticised briefly by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for his being influenced by Danish customs, but that does not appear to have tarnished his reputation too much. One of his first acts was to bring back the exiled Dunstan, who he eventually made Archbishop of Canterbury. In 963, Edgar and Athelwold, Bishop of Winchester, began a programme of monastery building, and in the process they drove out corruption from the clergy. So thorough was Athelwold's work that he too was later made a saint. In 965, Edgar would marry Elfrida, who would later be shown to be a woman of some ruthlessness. She is the chief suspect in the murder of Edgar's son from a previous marriage, Edward, in 978, in order for her and Edgar's son, Athelred, to become king. Given the troubled reign of Athelred, Elfrida's legacy to history is not a good one, unfortunately. Overall, Edgar's reign, through what the sources say, is noticeably stable. There were, as with all kingdoms at that time, periods of unrest, but Edgar appears to have dealt with them with the minimum of fuss. Given what was to happen over the course of the next 100 years after his death, his reign of nearly 16 years looks like almost peaceful bliss for Anglo-Saxon England. After Elfrida had murdered Edward the Martyr in 978, her son with Edgar the Peaceful, Athelred, became King Athelred II. Athelred as a man seems to have had good qualities. He was quite genial and likeable, and he had a grace befitting someone being king. Unfortunately, though, as time would tell, these personal qualities counted for very little. He was totally incapable of repressing the Viking raids. He had a total inability to grasp the tactic of paying them off. Danegeld was not working, as it only encouraged further Danish attacks. And he heeded the advice of counsellors who were no more intelligent than he was. It is because of these reasons that his reign proved to be a nigh-on calamity. The St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002 is one of the most pointless and brutal massacres in Anglo-Saxon history, and once again shows Athelred's poor judgment. During the massacre, the sister of the Danish king, Svein Forkbeard, was killed, and Svein would depose Athelred in 1013. Svein, though, would not enjoy the English throne for long, and he died early in 1014. Athelred returned to the throne briefly for another couple of years, but he died in 1016. When Athelred died, the throne was up for grabs, and the son of Svein Forkbeard would fight against Athelred's son, Edmund, who would later be known as Edmund Ironside. Edmund Ironside was a formidable warrior and quite unlike his hapless father. During the struggle against Canute, Edmund claimed early successes in 1016. He defeated the Danes in battle somewhere near Somerset, and by now Canute and the Danes were clearly well aware of Edmund's warrior reputation, and at a site in Kent they scattered before him, which led to a brutal slaughter of many Vikings. At this point, the tide appeared to be going in the favour of Edmund. However, push finally came to shove for Canute at the Battle of Ashington towards the end of 1016, when Canute was successful thanks to the treachery of an English nobleman by the name of Edric, who falsely told the English soldiers that Edmund had been killed, which led to panic in the Saxon ranks. And this led to a decisive victory for Canute. A peace was brokered which saw the country split into two for Edmund and Canute to rule over. but it's safe to say that Canute had no intention of sharing the kingdom, and so not long after, as the story goes, Edmund died in mysterious circumstances, supposedly murdered whilst going to the toilet, and dying in very horrible fashion, leading the whole kingdom to fall into the hands of the King of Denmark, Canute. Canute had won the day, though, through a combination of luck, ruthlessness, and treacherous Edric. Canute does not appear to have been too keen on Edric's actions, however, and he had him beheaded not long after. While this had ushered in a period of foreign rule in England, the story was not over yet for the Anglo-Saxons. Athelred's sons, Alfred and the future Edward the Confessor, were still in exile, and the infant son of Edmund Ironside, another Edward, who would become known as the Exile, would also follow them into exile and would become extremely well-travelled, and would play a role later on. Another person who had been abroad had been Emma, the widow of Athelred, who had been with her sons in her homeland of Normandy. She would return to marry Canute, and her son with him would become king before her own son Edward with Athelred would. Even though Canute now ruled England by himself, the prospects for him building a long-lasting dynasty in England were by no means guaranteed. As I have mentioned, the infant son of Edmund Ironside was sent into exile alongside his brother, and the sons of Athelred the Unready were also still alive in Normandy. Canute did have one son from his first marriage, Harold, who would become known as Harold Harefoot and would succeed Canute as king. And after his first wife died, Canute then took as his second wife Emma, the widow of Athelred II. And from that marriage they produced another son called Harthacnut, and he too would become king. So there was good news on this front for Canute in the sense that he had two potential successors, and they both did succeed as king, but there were also rival claimants. There were the two sons of Edmund Ironside, and on top of that there were the two sons of Athelred the Unready, Edward and Alfred. So whilst the dynasty looked relatively secure, there were also potential problems in the background with prospective usurpers. Perhaps in recognition of how difficult it had been in subduing the kingdom, Canute delegated power to three nobles: Turkil, who would preside over East Anglia; Edric, who I have mentioned already, would take Mercia; and a man called Eric in Northumbria. Canute himself would concentrate on Wessex. Ultimately, this plan didn't work out very well. Edric, as I mentioned, was beheaded, and Eric was forced to flee after falling out with Canute. Canute was advised to dispose first of the sons of Edmund Ironside, the little Edward, who would be known as Edward the Exile, and his brother Edmund. Apparently, the Danish king didn't wish to carry out the act himself, perhaps in order not to stain his shaky reputation in England so early into his reign, and so sent the boys back to Scandinavia, where, in theory, the deed would be carried out. The King of Sweden, however, refused to kill the boys, and they eventually ended up at the court of the Hungarian king, and they would later play a role in English politics. Meanwhile, Canute continued to suppress rebellions in England by stamping out uprisings and using his army to extract huge sums of money from places where he was still being given a lot of trouble, including London. Around 1019, however, things seemed to settle down a bit, and Canute seemed to grow more secure on the throne. So secure did he feel that he returned to Denmark, where he'd spend a whole winter. Canute's authority continued to grow stronger, and Turkil, who had been overseeing matters in East Anglia, as I've just mentioned, was exiled from England altogether, after Canute seemed to deem him dispensable. A year later, though, Turkil and Canute were reconciled, and Canute, perhaps to get Turkil out of the way for good, sent him to look after matters in Denmark. Canute, though, would have to return to Denmark himself in 1026 with a combined force of English and Danish, in order to repel an attack from two Swedes by the name of Eglaf and Ulf. Canute, however, would be defeated in battle and suffered significant losses. That blow aside, prospects for Canute's English realm were good. He received an oath of loyalty from the Scottish king Malcolm II, and also from the future king of Scots, a man called Macbeth. In 1028, Canute defeated the king of Norway, Olaf II, who, when he tried to return to Norway after being exiled, was killed by his own subjects. Canute was now King of England, Denmark, and Norway. On the death of Canute in 1035, he was succeeded by his oldest son, Harold, in England, and his son by his marriage to Emma, Harthacnut, in Denmark. As a ruler, Canute was a strong king. He predictably favoured his fellow countrymen when he became King of England, handing over to them English-held lands and property. He was wise enough to delegate power to others, as from 1028 onwards he was king of 3 countries, and ruling over them single-handedly would have been no mean feat even for a capable man such as himself. However, his legacy in England is quite limited. There will be no long-lasting Danish dynasty, and in 1042, on the death of Harthacnut, there will be no more Scandinavian kings of England again, although Harold Hardrada would attempt to seize the throne in 1066. On the death of his father Canute, Harold Harefoot became King of England ahead of his half-brother Harthacnut, who remained in Denmark. The name Harefoot isn't recorded until much later, but likely refers to Harold's fleetness of foot. The succession did not go altogether undisputed. The most powerful man in England at that time was a man by the name of Earl Godwin, who was the father of another Harold who would famously die at the Battle of Hastings. Godwin and other nobles attempted to resist the succession of Harold Harefoot, but to no avail. Emma, the mother of Harthacnut and stepmother of Harold Harefoot, initially went to Winchester to hold Wessex on behalf of Harthacnut, but was soon driven into exile by King Harold. Harold Harefoot now held full control over all England. But in 1036, Earl Godwin carried out a particularly brutal act. The sons of Athelred the Unready, who had remained in exile for over 20 years, returned to England in order to see their mother, Emma, who was still in Winchester at the time. Supposedly, in an act of loyalty to King Harold, Earl Godwin and his men attacked Edward and Arthur's retinue, blinding, mutilating, and killing many of them. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that Alfred was blinded as soon as he stepped off the ship. So brutal was the act that Alfred died of his injuries, being attended upon by a group of monks till he died painfully. It is an act wholly unjustifiable, and it is worth remembering in the grand scheme of things later on. What Earl Godwin had demonstrated was a ruthless streak to protect the interests of not only the King of England, supposedly, but also the interests of himself too, and his family. These young men were sons of a former king of England and a very real counterclaimant to the throne. If they had been united with their mother, a plot could have been formed to put one of them on the throne, and Earl Godwin, most powerful noble in the country, would be in serious jeopardy as someone that had not only been loyal to a previous regime, but a completely foreign dynasty, and a dynasty that had made Edward and Alfred spend 20 years in exile, as well as one that had deposed their father. Edward and Alfred would also have been a distinctly more preferable alternative to a Danish monarchy, so their popularity in England would have been significant. But Earl Godwin had demonstrated an instinct for political survival, and his treatment of Alfred, as repugnant as it is, shows why he and his son were considered the most powerful men in England outside the king. This act of political savagery was the most significant event of the reign of Harold Harefoot, and it would end when he died in 1040 at Oxford. Harold's body was dumped in a bog by his half-brother Harthacnut. Harthacnut's reign was mostly memorable for how he died. At a feast, he was drinking heavily in the Viking fashion when he crashed down to the ground suddenly. There are different theories on how Harthacnut died, but the most obvious answer is he simply drank himself to death. With that ended the 27-year Danish rule over England. The crown was now to return to the hands of the Anglo-Saxons, and the new king was Edward, son of Athelred II, who had escaped Earl Godwin's brutal treatment. Edward's reign would cast the last two Danish kings into basically complete obscurity, and both Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut have been almost completely forgotten. Edward's own death would alter the course of English history forever. Edward was a pious man, indicated by the fact that he is known to history as the Confessor. It has been suggested that his piety was the chief cause of his marriage remaining childless, although some historians have discounted that. Nonetheless, his marriage was a fateful one. His wife was a woman by the name of Edith, daughter of Earl Godwin, and so also the sister of the future King Harold II. Edward's reign was a notably long one, over 23 years. His lack of heirs is an interesting issue to ponder. He had plenty of time to sire more than enough children if he had really wanted to. Even if his marriage to Edith, who ended up in a nunnery, was barren, a king of his time could have been expected to annul his marriage with Edith and perhaps try with another woman, although Edward's piety may have stood in the way of that particular solution. It's also possible Edward needed to remain on the good side of Earl Godwin. Divorcing his daughter would have alienated the powerful Godwin family and given Edward a major problem, and possibly one that may have led to his deposition. Edward and Godwin's relationship was not always an easy or amicable one. In the early 1050s, rumour that Godwin and Harold were plotting against the king soon reached Edward's ears. They were both sent into exile, but did not remain there long, and were soon back in England, plundering on the south coast. It is an indication of how formidable a power the Godwin family was, that they were not out in the cold for long, and were soon reconciled to Edward. Earl Godwin himself died in 1053, and his lands and territories were succeeded to by his son Harold. Harold soon became Edward's main man, restoring peace after an uprising had broken out in 1055. Again in the early 1060s, Harold dealt with a rebellion, this time in Wales. Through a combination of military strength and diplomacy, Harold soon restored order. Although Harold remained loyal to the king, his brother Tostig was completely different. He was not a popular man and was universally disliked, and he had absolutely no loyalty to anybody. He had been outlawed and then exiled from his own earldom, and it was through his treachery that England was invaded by Harold Hardrada, perhaps indirectly changing the course of history, although that is purely guesswork. So when Edward the Confessor died in 1066 without heirs, who was to succeed him? William of Normandy claimed he had been promised a crown by Edward when he visited England, but Harold Godwinson looked altogether a better candidate. He had demonstrated firsthand the kingly skills required. He was a strong military leader, diplomatic when needed, and what would have been preferable to most nobles, if not all of them, was the fact that he was English. There was also a third claimant, a man from Norway, a giant of a man from Norway, Harold III Hardrada. In my mind, though, Edward's preferred candidate to the throne, if it wasn't to be a son or blood relative of his, would have been Harold Godwinson. I find it hard to believe he would have made a promise to leave his kingdom to a foreign duke without categorically reaffirming it. He also would have known it would have been a tremendously unpopular decision and would lead to anarchy and difficult times for the country. A pious man would have wanted to leave behind a stable country. It's possible that he had a change of heart, but Harold must have looked to him to be the most obvious candidate as he lay dying.